Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Dozens of House Democrats tell Biden to support ending Yemen war. The lawmakers want Biden to declare he won't support the Saudi-led coalition if the conflict reignites. During the campaign, if you all recall, Biden said, "We're stepping up our diplomacy to end the war in Yemen. I will end U.S. support for offensive operations in Yemen." How significant is this? Well, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Professor Horne, China is demonstrating how its direct involvement can first bring about a cessation of hostilities, then stability, and eventually peace. In a major diplomatic breakthrough, the Saudis and the Houthis recently held talks in Sana'a, but a peace deal has yet to be reached. Now, amid the negotiations, the U.S. officials traveled to the Saudis and, according to Axios, underscored the U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's defense against threats from Yemen, signaling the Biden administration is ready to support Riyadh if it flares up. So you've got the Chinese laying the groundwork for peace. Now Biden seems to want to send folks in and say, hey, y'all, you know, if you want to start fighting again, we got you. Go ahead, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, obviously, it was well for you to place China front and center with regard to the story, because their ability to broker an entente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are on opposite sides of the fence with regard to the conflict in Yemen, has obvious ricochet effect in terms of leading to what I would hope to be the ultimate settlement of that conflict. But as with our discussion in recent weeks about Sudan, in order to understand this conflict in Yemen, once again, you have to go back to that witch's brew known as the Cold War, because it was then that you had a regime in Aden, a major port on the Red Sea. I'm speaking of the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, led by a left-wing political party that I would hope would attract more attention from journalists and scholars. What happens is that there is a split within the ruling party, as happened, I'm afraid, all too frequently during the Cold War amongst certain left-wing parties. There were actual shootouts in leadership meetings, and the situation deteriorated from there. Obviously, the hand of Washington was involved in this discord, and that has sent Yemen spiraling downward to where it is now one of the major problems in the world today with regard to securing international peace and security. Certainly, to return to Sudan, that conflict, which is still bubbling over, is not helping the conflict in Yemen insofar as you're having refugees from Sudan fleeing eastward, many to Saudi Arabia, but of course many to Yemen as well. And with regard to Mr. Biden, one would hope and imagine that he would draw logical conclusions with regard to his failed policy in Saudi Arabia, which has not necessarily drawn dividends. And in fact, we all know that the Saudis and some of their allies in the Gulf have basically tossed a $2 billion kitty to Jared Kushner, Mr. Trump's son-in-law, for him to invest, quote unquote, and play with. And I think that may be a signal that the Saudis do not necessarily expect Mr. Biden to be returning to the White House in January 2025. And in light of that, one would imagine that the United States has little interest, I would imagine, in backing the Saudis' failing campaign in Yemen, that it might, in fact, help to shed light on why these legislators in Washington are pressing for peace. Perhaps they're acting as sock puppets for the Biden administration, which can then act as if they're acting on the behest and behalf of these legislators in Washington and providing a convenient out for Mr. Biden to change the U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia. Now, obviously, there are a lot of subjunctives in what I've just said, and perhaps some might even say wishful thinking. But I do think that we should welcome this initiative from these legislators in Washington and only hope that their path is imitated.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's interesting that these are the exact same people that a few months ago were saying we have to hold MBS accountable and we have to make them outcasts, blah, blah, blah. And now they're realizing, well, the other powers in the world have non-interventionist clauses, shall we say, in their diplomacy, and we're driving everybody away. But this is an important story, although pretty horrifying. NATO to draw up Russia war plans for the first time since the Cold War. Alliance leaders will approve thousands of pages of secret military plans that detail how to respond to a Russian attack. Well, number one, I don't think Russia has any plans to attack them, but yet and still, it seems to me, based on what NATO has said about defensive actions, that usually when they say they're a defensive alliance, they mean they're an offensive alliance. Your thoughts?
Well, this is an ominous story. It should be obvious. And what is perhaps even more ominous is that as we speak, the so-called Group of Seven, the pirates led by Mr. Biden and his sidekicks in Tokyo and Western Europe and Canada, are meeting 700 miles from the shores of the People's Republic of China, which is going to be a major focus of the so-called G7 summit, along with the question of the Ukraine. The fact that NATO, or the story has come out about NATO supposedly developing war plans with regard to Russia should not be coming as a shock or surprise, because we can see those war plans, or at least stage one of those war plans, erupting and evolving as we speak with regard to Ukraine. It's no secret, as Secretary Austin of the Pentagon put it, that a purpose of this Ukraine escapade is to drain Russia militarily. And I would add the further caveat that this is only a stage towards going after the big enchilada, which is the People's Republic of China. And in that regard, keep in mind the overlap between the G7 and NATO. Keep in mind as well that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, somehow got their geography confused and have opened up an affiliate office in Japan. This is a step towards illustrating what should be obvious to even the most demented observer, which is that NATO, under the leadership of the United States, has plans for world domination. And this cannot necessarily be even good news for the peoples of Japan, of South Korea, which apparently has signed on to this nonsense, even though China is one of their major trading partners. And perhaps NATO should be forced to acknowledge that what they're devising is the worst of all worlds, because A, it won't work, and B, it could lead to the extinction of all humanity.
There's a statement in this piece: the fundamental difference between crisis management and collective defense is this: it is not we, but our adversary who determines the timeline. This is Admiral Rob Bauer, one of NATO's top military officials. We have to prepare for the fact that conflict can present itself at any time. What seems to be lacking or missing from Admiral Bauer's assessment is it's the United States is picking the fight, and that what Japan is doing is defending itself. What Russia is doing is defending itself. And it seems as though Macron understands that. It seems as though Zelensky understands that. And there are other members of NATO that seem to be understanding that, which is why they're making their treks to China with their economic advisors and business people in tow. They seem to understand that, but it's the United States narrative that is controlling the day.
Well, it would be well to return to the remarkable full-page ad that appeared in the New York Times just a few days ago, signed by the Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs, the former U.S. ambassador to the then Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, which, among other things, pointed out that NATO is basically a racket. That is to say, when you expand NATO, then you force countries like Poland, for example, to cough up a significant percentage of their treasury to buy weapons for or from Lockheed Martin and other charter members of the U.S. military-industrial complex.
Let me give some evidence to what you've just said, because the next sentence in this piece says, by outlining what it calls its regional plans, NATO will also give nations guidance on how to upgrade their forces and logistics. That means here are the purchase orders, here's what you buy, and here's who you buy from.
And so the ultimate beneficiary are those executives in the military-industrial complex who are searching for an upgraded mini mansion in Falls Church, Virginia. The losers are, of course, the ordinary citizenry of nations like Poland. And the ultimate losers might be all of humanity, because it's difficult to accumulate these weapons without devising plans to use them. Hence, circling back to the original story about NATO deepening war plans towards Russia, because I don't think we should see this idea of NATO having a war plan towards Russia as being particularly novel or particularly even news. Basically, what we're talking about is deepening of plans that have been sitting on the shelf for decades now.
Turkish elections. Middle East Eye reports the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's aides believe he will comfortably emerge victorious in the runoff presidential elections on the 28th of May. So they're focusing on running a, quote, more unifying and positive campaign than previously. Your thought on the Turkish elections?
Well, as we've indicated previously on these airwaves, Washington and NATO in general are sorely disappointed with the outcome of the first stage of the election. They were hoping and praying, if not working assiduously, for the defeat of Mr. Erdogan. Keep in mind what happened in the summer of 2016 when there was an attempted military coup against Mr. Erdogan. He barely escaped with his life intact, and he immediately blamed Washington and the Obama administration. Since that time, understandably, relations between Ankara and Washington have headed south. Mr. Erdogan, of course, has a certain amount of culpability because he was a major supporter of these religious zealots who were seeking to overthrow his neighbor. Speaking of Mr. al-Assad's Syria, who, by the way, is being embraced by the Arab League as we speak, another defeat for pro-Zionist U.S. foreign policy. And by seeking to destabilize al-Assad, Mr. Erdogan was basically creating a problem on his own border. First of all, you had the flooding into Syria, into Turkey, of numerous Syrian refugees. And even though his opposition is supposed to be on the left, they're campaigning demagogically about the idea of expelling these Syrian refugees. And of course, this comes with ill grace for Washington to embrace such an anti-Erdogan campaign, since supposedly the Democratic administration in Washington, we are told at least, is not engaging in demagogy with regard to the arrival of refugees on these North American shores. So quite typically, we see the U.S. administration tied up like a bowl of spaghetti or a convoluted pretzel in trying to develop and devise a policy towards Turkey that makes any coherent or rational sense. Certainly, I think we can well expect a victory for Mr. Erdogan on May 28th in the second stage of these presidential elections. And therefore, you will continue to see Turkey acting as a backdoor for exports into Russia. You will see that Turkey also will seek, I hope, to back down with regard to its failed policy in Syria. Syria, of course, being rescued from being overthrown by religious zealots because of the intervention of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is bad news for NATO. It's even more bad news because Mr. Erdogan has turned thumbs down thus far on Sweden entering the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Supposedly, Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO, although you never know it from reading the U.S. press.
U.S. and Syria holding secret talks in Oman. This is in Orinoco Tribune, and they are reprinting a Cradle story. A senior diplomatic official in the Arab League has revealed exclusively to the Cradle that secret direct negotiations are currently taking place between the U.S. and Syrian governments. We got about a minute 45. Your thoughts on this, Dr. Horne?
Well, this is inevitable in light of the fact that Syria is being embraced by the Arab League, in light of the fact that an entente has been brokered between Syria's major partners, speaking of Iran and Saudi Arabia, which had been one of the major opponents of the al-Assad regime in Damascus. It was inevitable that Washington would be dragged kicking and screaming towards reality. And I'm afraid to say that that's usually what happens when Washington acknowledges reality. It's not through common good sense and rationality. It's usually against their own fervent wishes. And so these talks in Oman have a certain inevitability to it, but certainly it will complicate Washington's relations with Israel because Israel is a dead ender and a diehard with regard to seeking to overthrow and batter the al-Assad regime. Washington, which has larger fish to fry, apparently is moving in a different direction.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.